We had last year, obviously. We had 1 year. It's kind of freaking me out. I mean, I know that his hypothesis, and then look at his test of the hypothesis. I don't know. I don't understand. I don't I would have Amanda, yeah, Joel and someone else. 4 hours. That's so long. Yeah, so he was all so grumpy and so. Was it just money? Yeah, that's, I would do that. What? Okay, not helpful. Does not tell you how I was talking. I'll be clear about you. No, I liked it that. The task like those. Is the hypothesis? Which was the hypothesis, it's just weird. I don't need to hypothesis. It's like just like making it a long. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'll do that too. I feel like I'll do it that. So then it's like.
Have you had a chance to look at assignment number 1 and did you have questions about it? Are there things that are unclear or does it seem in any way problematic to you?
I apologize if this is already mentioned in the syllabus, but how long do you want this to be?
Not very long.
Okay.
There is no determined, it kind of depends on the argument. Basically what you're doing is you're setting up a theory as an argument. Probably not as long as the example I gave you from Durkheim. It would probably be much shorter than that. Certainly you could fit it on a page, probably half a page.
Got it. Oh, okay.
Yeah. If you took geometry in high school, you remember like the Euclidean theorem or something like it, right? It's pretty short, right? That's basically a theory, right? It's a set of propositions leading to a conclusion. Of course, the Euclidean theorem is a purely logical argument, and it's not, I think, open to empirical test. Although there are arguments that that empirically you can demonstrate non-Euclidean forms of geometry. But, the whole point here is that you have essentially a logical argument like you might have in geometry. The difference is that this is a logical argument leading to a hypothesis or what you could in theory test, although you're not actually going to test it. Okay, so if you do have any questions about that, then let me know. I don't think it's really that much of a challenge. The whole point here is to set up the idea of sociology as a science, as things that are demonstrable. This also, by the way, directly relates to the question that we'll try to deal with today, this difficult question of social science and politics, and how politics should or should not influence social science, a point about which not everyone will agree. But the way that this is set up, it is a factual coming up with an argument leading to a testable question of fact. All right, well, we had started on Thursday talking about ethics and social science methods, and the fact that when we're studying human beings, ethical questions always come up. And of course, ethical questions overlap with political questions when research serves political ends. Not only are there questions about what kinds of ends should it serve, but what is it justifiable to do in pursuit of social scientific ends? And we had kind of treated that a little bit on this past Thursday, looking at Project Camelot, talking about sociologists who served, or social scientists who served the war in Vietnam, about which American citizens disagreed greatly. I guess, one of the problems that people often raise about things like Project Camelot are not simply that it served the ends of the CIA. And, to judge that, you would have to be judged, do you agree with the ends of the CIA or not? But also there's an argument that in the process of doing so, the social scientists took an end justifies the means kind of approach, where you could suppress political movements of people in their own countries. And so it's not simply the political end, but also the process that is judged as crossing ethical boundaries. This is not simply something that is ancient history dating back to the 1960s. This is also highly contemporary. And we might, before we move on to looking at the question of the political ends of social science, think about how this continues to be relevant today. You know what this phrase enhanced interrogation refers to? Another word that many people would use for enhanced interrogation is torture. Things like waterboarding, depriving subjects of sleep. Enhanced interrogation techniques were developed, not by sociologists. I don't know of any sociologists who were involved in this, but by psychologists, by psychological researchers, including the researcher in this particular article, James Mitchell, who worked as a contractor for the CIA, developing techniques of enhanced interrogation. And he argued that he saw his work as a moral duty and that he would do it again to protect American citizens. Well, there may be some people who would agree with him. Many others would argue that not only is torture ineffective as an interrogation technique, but that it's also inherently unethical. And this is certainly one of the kinds of things that would be covered by disciplinary rules on ethical behavior in social research. And probably if he's a member of the American Psychological Association, he might be subject to sanctions by the American Psychological Association.
That was my question. Was this case backed by the APA? Wasn't that a whole thing? And they testified as well, saying that it was condoned. Like research had proven something along.
Yeah, that I don't know. I don't think the APA testified that they approved of enhanced interrogation techniques. we're criticized, oh, here we go. Mitchell and Jensen were criticized for leaving a stain on the discipline of psychology by the American Psychological Association. So no, it wasn't. Well, actually, the word sanction has two different meanings that are actually completely opposite. One, to impose sanctions means to punish, but to sanction something can mean to approve it, right? So there's a little bit of a blur in the meaning of the words there. But the APA was actually opposed to it. And one, it would have difficulty imagining a great many academic psychologists or the academic social scientists who could develop techniques for torture and not be heavily disapproved of by most of their colleagues. Okay, so one of the issues of politics in the social sciences is what kinds of activities do your political ends promote or permit? And when do you cross ethical boundaries in pursuing political ends? But I think it goes beyond that. And we'll talk a little bit today about the problem of political ends in and of themselves as social science, as determining how social science is done and what the ends and processes of social science are. Let's look a little bit at first a somewhat long case, and then at a chunk within that, a piece of writing by Max Weber. Probably many of you, if you took Sociology 2010, you heard about Max Weber, or maybe you read some short sections from him. What do you remember about Max Weber's writings, his theories, his ideas? Anything? Other than the fact that he was an important sociological theorist. Well, we'll look at that a little bit now. This is Max Weber's article. It was actually from a speech in 1918, Wissenschaft als Beruf, or Science as a Vocation, in which he talked about science, including social science, as a calling, as a vocation literally means a calling. In German, Beruf means more explicitly a calling. And in this article, he talks about social science within the process of modernization. Now, one of the things that you might remember, if I jar your memories a little bit about Max Weber, is that he was the great theorist of rationalization and of bureaucratization and of what's often called disenchantment. Max Weber argued that as societies become more modern, they tend to move toward more bureaucratized ways of doing things. Now, what bureaucratization means is in part specialization, that each person is specialized in doing a specific job within a social organization. And although today we often think of bureaucracies in a negative sense, he didn't think that bureaucracies were entirely negative. Bureaucracies are an efficient way of doing things. I mean, if you think about Tulane University, perhaps you'll agree with me that Tulane is bureaucracy. And sometimes we think that Tulane is a bureaucracy in the negative sense of the word, in the sense that, it's a lot of red tape, it's a lot of, you have to go through things. But you could also think of it as an efficient way of doing things, right? For me to get paid, there has to be a Department of Human Resources, people who are specialized in that particular job, in that particular slot. And there have to be, people who are specialized in the library, right? This is a bureaucracy. It's a kind of a pyramidal organization where everyone is specialized in their own particular activity. And that's part of rationalization. Rationalization means that our activities are organized according to systemization, according to reason. And this also relates to science as a modern activity, as Weber saw it, that science has become something in which you have specialized scientists who are solving problems, and they're solving problems in a highly organized and narrow sense. Like you could see this like in your own assignment number 1, right? What you're doing is you're coming up with an argument, a rational argument, a logical argument, and then a way of proving that argument. And in doing this, you're not using inspiration. You're not filled with the spirit, although you might be enthusiastic about what you're doing. But in itself, it's a highly specialized and highly, you might say desiccated. Desiccated means like dry, a dry activity. And science you could see as a dry activity. Now, when Weber talked about rationalization and bureaucracies, he also saw a downside to bureaucracies. And that is when we rationalize our activities, this also leads to what he called disenchantment. Disenchantment means that when we carry out our day-to-day lives, we're going to work, we're doing our jobs, we're going to our offices, we're not inspired by the spirits, we're not engaging in magical activities. Instead, rationalization leads us to, in a sense, really narrow our activities. And this kind of disenchantment leads us to focus on the practical and the technical. Now, this is also a challenge for people. People don't want to simply concentrate on the practical and the technical in their lives. The moral also means something for them. What gives meaning to their lives means something for them. And Weber argues that science can't give us ultimate answers in the way that religion can give us. That's what part of what it means when we say that science is disenchanted. The enchantment of religious ways of thinking is taken away. Now, one possible replacement for religious ways of thinking is moral ways of thinking, right? Think about what's the meaning of life. Weber did not argue here that that science is without presuppositions, right? That it's without any value orientations whatsoever. He argued, in fact, that regarding the search for truth is a value orientation. A commitment to logic and evidence is a value orientation. He did not consider the fact that, I think, that what we look at may also be guided by our value orientations. But in this essay, he essentially came up with what we still today call the value-free approach to sociology, or wertfrei, value-free. Now, I know that when I was first studying sociology as an undergraduate, Max Weber's value-free approach was often presented as kind of a straw man argument. Do you know what I mean by a straw man argument? What's a straw man? Is that phrase familiar to you? Say it's something. A straw man argument is an argument that you make so that you can knock it down. It's an argument that you make that is artificially weak, that you could so that you can knock it down. And the straw man version of Max Weber's argument that I was presented with, that I think is still presented to students often today, is that Weber says that sociology can be value-free. However, we know that values always influence everything that we do. Therefore, Max Weber is wrong. Sociology cannot be value-free. Therefore, sociology must be value-driven. Now, I don't think that Max Weber was arguing here that values have no relevance whatsoever to the way that we approach science. He did talk about presuppositions. And this idea that because you can never be completely free of values, therefore your research should be value-driven, may also be problematic. The late Irving Horowitz, influential sociologist, said that this argument was a little bit like saying that because you could never have a completely aseptic environment, because you could never have a completely clean environment, that therefore you should do surgery in a sewer, right? That because we can never be completely free of our values, therefore we should just let our values drive our research. Which he argued was to take the biggest problem of social sciences, that is that we're all biased in some way, and instead of recognizing it as a problem, place it at the center of the social scientific activity so that our political biases become what drives our whole research. Now, there's legitimate debates about the extent to which political orientation, political ideas should drive social sciences and should drive sociology in particular. Let's look at a section within this article that is reproduced here. This is actually from inside of that article. It's the most relevant part. And Weber says that it is said, and I agree, that politics is out of place in the lecture room. That often seems like kind of a strange comment in today's often highly politicized academic world. But he says that when speaking in a political meeting about democracy, one does not hide one's personal standpoint. And the words are used not as a means of scientific analysis, but as a means of canvassing votes. Now, if you think about the difference between speaking at a meeting and engaging in research, is there a difference between trying to persuade people and trying to find out what's true? Or are those the same thing? Is there any difference between standing up at a meeting and speaking about what you think is the case and trying to find out what's true? Or are those the same thing? When you speak up at the meeting, Do you already have an idea about what you believe is true? Yeah, you're already trying to persuade people to come over to your point of view. You're trying to get people to think the way that you think they ought to think. When you investigate, you're assuming that you don't know. You're assuming that you might be wrong and you want to find out what's true. Now, it's not a very effective means of rhetoric to tell people that, well, I really don't know what I'm saying, and I think I'd like to look more deeply into the argument that I'm making. That's not a very persuasive form of rhetoric, right? Politics involves rhetoric. It doesn't involve a careful investigation into the nature of the truth. And Weber distinguishes here. He says, to the prophet and the demagogue, it is said, go out, go your ways out into the streets and speak openly to the world. In the lecture room, we stand opposite our audience. Now, you know, I think that one of the things we have to do in the lecture room is recognize where it is that our views might be influenced. Nevertheless, you know, I think this contrast between the sociologist as social scientist and the prophet and the demagogue is worth keeping in mind, right? The prophet is someone who attempts to speak moral truths. The social scientist is someone who seeks to investigate what actually is true in the world. Now, there's a lot of appeal to being a prophet. Being a social scientist also implies a certain amount of disenchantment. It's a lot more satisfying to speak moral truths, to talk about what you believe is justice, to talk about what you believe is the moral way to act, what government ought to do, what your fellow citizens ought to do, than it is to reserve judgment and try to investigate the nature of reality. And, you know, there is a real question about the extent to which social scientists, either as researchers or as teachers, should be engaging in advocacy as opposed to attempting to understand the nature of reality. Now, what does this mean for contemporary sociology? As I said a minute ago, when I first went into sociology, Max Weber's argument about value-free sociology was often used as a straw man. That is something to be set up in order to not be knocked down, right? That sociology can't be free of advocacy, therefore sociology must be advocacy. Let's look at what that seems to mean in contemporary sociology, as reflected in the major sociological organization, that is the American Sociological Association. And I understand. And maybe we can do that by looking at the themes of sociological meanings. And we can ask ourselves, is this social science in the sense that Max Weber had understood it? Or is this sociology as a form of moral prophecy, as a form of advocacy and rhetoric? Now, themes are chosen by the person who's elected president of the American Sociological Association. If we respect intellectual freedom, we have to respect the right of whoever's elected to choose whatever theme that person chooses, right? So, one thing we have to consider about the political ends of social science is that we can't tell people they can't take political goals, they can't have political views, because this would be a violation of their academic freedom. This would be a violation of their freedom to make up their own minds and think for themselves. We also have to recognize that I think that the folks who are elected, their orientations are not hidden, and that these are people who are elected by the members of the American Sociological Association. And therefore, they must reflect the views of at least a large portion of the main sociological organization. All right, well, let's look at some of the meetings here, at some of the themes of these meetings. This past year, which was a virtual meeting, and I'm sure you understand why meetings are virtual these days, was emancipatory sociology. Emancipation is not a value-neutral point of view, right? It is a highly activist and advocacy-oriented point of view. Again, the argument in favor of that would be that the president has the right to choose whatever theme he or she feels is relevant to his or her own work. And the members have a right to elect any president they choose. The year before that, power, inequality, resistance, and work. The year before that, engaging social justice for a better world. All of this sounds pretty prophetic, right? All of this sounds really advocacy-oriented and really oriented toward not sociology as the disenchanted scientific approach that Max Weber would have understood, but as a form of moral prophecy, as a form of trying to convince other people about one's own ideological orientations. Okay, so I think that what we can say is that there's a real tension here between sociology as a value-free science in the sense that Max Weber would have understood, and sociology as a form of prophecy, political rhetoric, and advocacy. I had commented on this tendency of sociology to institutionalize ideology in a little online article. And we can look at that for just a minute and then look at some of the questions. Now, this question about the politicization of sociology is an ongoing issue, and it is a matter of debate. It's not something that is generally accepted. We'll talk about this case of James Coleman in a minute. But during the 1990s, sociology did go through a period of relative professionalization. In other words, it went through a period in which politics wasn't entirely removed from the discipline, but in which the focus on finding out what is true moved to the forefront. I think sociology began to move away from this relatively apolitical and relatively neutral standpoint at the beginning of the 21st century. The century that most of you, that all of you, I think, have been personally familiar with, since I'm assuming that everyone here that all of you have lived your entire lives within the 21st century. And in 2000, the newly elected president of the American Sociological Association, Joe R. Fagan, chose as his meeting theme oppression, domination, and liberation. And in his presidential address, he called for a decidedly radical liberation sociology. Now, of course, that opens the question of what does that mean for sociologists who may not be radical, or sociologists who may be radical in some other way, or who may shape, sure, part of his political orientations, but not all of his political orientations. The politicization of sociology was a matter of debate. In 2003, the American Sociological Association passed a resolution calling for the end of the war in Iraq immediately after the United States had invaded Iraq, and for the withdrawal of its forces. Now, I actually think that the invasion of Iraq was neither wise nor justified. But this is, my own view, and one can question whether this should be established as the view of an institution that promotes this idea and seeks to speak on behalf of all of its members. A minority of sociologists submitted a response. One of those sociologists was the communitarian sociologist Amitai Etzioni. Communitarian, he obviously has his own political orientations, but they argued that the American Sociological Association had violated its own code of professional ethics by using organizational means to advance political and moral causes. A little bit after that, we began to hear about this phrase, public sociology. It's a phrase that has different meanings in the ears of many different people. If public sociology means simply weighing in on public issues, then of course all sociology is public sociology. But the ASA president, Michael Burawoy, who chose public sociology as the theme of the 2004 meeting, seemed to identify sociology with a program of left-wing activism. Burawoy has taken different positions on this. At some points, he seemed to argue that public sociology simply means that sociologists should weigh in on public issues. However, in the 2005 issue of Critical Sociology, Burawoy argued that public sociology could have, quote, a progressive impact by promoting a vision of what he called democratic socialism. And I think he gave evidence that he saw sociology as an institutional ideology, as a program of political action, and as a particular ideological orientation. The president of the ASA in the year after that, Francis Fox Piven, who was elected in 2006, made the ideological nature of public sociology even clearer. She considered what kind of politics public sociology should encourage. And she proclaimed that sociology should produce what she called a politicized sociology that is unashamed of the left. In other words, that sociology should be a left-wing political discipline. Now, I think the important point here is that Burawoy and Francis Fox Piven were not simply declaring their own political views. They were announcing a political view for an institution on behalf of all of its members. Now, one problem that I see here, aside from the idea of how does ideology influence the process of social research, is the problem of conformity and of intellectual freedom, right? If sociology is a discipline that is of the left, what would this mean for sociologists who either are not of the left or who are not of the left in the way that it's defined by Piven and Burrowoy? This is, I think, one of the difficulties with political belief in sociology. And, you know, as I remark here, a lot of times when you go to a professional meeting these days, it seems like a revivalist camp. I don't know how many of you have ever been to a religious revival. It seems like it is a so far on the side of prophecy that it is not simply a group of people who have political orientations that they share in common, but that the whole gathering is devoted to exaltation in a political orientation. It's re-enchanting the world. So, you know, I think that there is a difficulty beyond simply how does the politicization of social science influence how individuals carry out their research, but there's also the problem of conformity that we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Now, one of the most interesting developments within the politicization of sociology, I think, has to do with the prominent sociologist, James S. Coleman. And when you were taking Sociology 2010 or in some other course, did you hear about James Coleman or study his work anywhere? James S. Coleman died, I believe, I think it was about 1991 that he died, or the early 1990s. Must have been a little bit later than that. Must have been maybe 1994, 1995. James S. Coleman, one of the founders of rational choice theory and sociology, one of the founders of social capital theory, and his work did have political implications. And it was encouraged by his own political orientations. So politics is not entirely irrelevant here. James S. Coleman was highly active in the civil rights movement. He had at one point gone to jail when he and his family accompanied a Black family to a public park to try to integrate the park. He was deeply committed to the goals of the civil rights movement. So, you know, politics is not irrelevant from Coleman's work. Coleman was also interested in this critical problem of what is it that creates equality of opportunity for all people in American society. Now, something to keep in mind here is that he's motivated by political goals, but he doesn't let his political views influence what he sees. or he tries to see things without wearing the blinders of political goals. In 1966, I believe it was, Coleman and a set of co-authors had published a book, published a study, a report, often known as the Coleman Report, Equality of Educational Opportunity. And they looked at what is it that actually creates educational opportunity for students in schools. This is a critical point because what your opportunities in life are in modern American society often derive from your educational background. I assume that that's one reason you're all here, right? Is that what kind of education you get determines what kind of opportunities you have. Coleman was interested in the idea of equality of educational opportunity, but more specifically, he was interested in what makes inequality of racial opportunity. And he and his colleagues undertook this study of what are the determinants of educational outcomes of students. What determines how well students do in school, what they learn, which in turn plays a large part in shaping what their future educational chances are and what their chances are later in life. And they came up with some really interesting answers. They found that what seemed to influence the educational opportunities of students least were the material resources of school. Do you know what I mean by material resources? What kinds of things might be material resources?
Textbooks?
Yeah, like textbooks. Textbooks are material, the quality of textbooks. It's really not that big an influence on outcomes of students. Or libraries, or say the physical structure of the school, or how much money you put into the school, which, and there's a big line of research that still maintains that how much money you pour into schools doesn't really have big influence on outcomes. By the way, New Orleans has one of the highest per capita school spending, per student school spending levels in the state of Louisiana. And it does not have a particularly good educational reputation. So there's a lot of evidence to support this idea that, well, resources are not irrelevant, but they're not the thing that really makes for opportunity in schools. Now, let's have a caveat here. There is an opportunity, there is a resource that you probably would not have found in schools in definitely would not have found in schools in 1966. Can you think of what that resource might be? What material resource, what educational tool didn't exist in 1966? Yeah, I remember when my father took me to his office to look at his computer, it was the size of this room, right? And even when I was in college, when we were doing our research methods class, we didn't do it on our laptops. We had to do a survey of respondents, and then every respondent had to have a key punch card. And then you would take your big stack of key punch cards to the person behind the desk, and you'd give it to the person behind the desk, and he'd feed it through this huge computer, and you'd get a readout saying you did it all wrong. You got to key punch all of your cards again. So, you know, one could plausibly argue that computers might make a difference in terms of the relevance of material resources. I'm not sure that that's necessarily true, but you know, Coleman and his associates found that resources were the least important influence on outcomes. Somewhat more important were the qualities of teachers, how much experience teachers had, what their degrees were, and other measurable qualities of teachers, which is, kind of heartening. But what they found was the biggest influence on student outcomes was the socioeconomic makeup of the schools, and not the socioeconomic makeup of individual students, not students' own socioeconomic makeup, but the socioeconomic makeup of those around them. In other words, going to school with people who have advantages is one of the best ways that you can have of getting ahead. Going to school with people who have disadvantages can inhibit your own life opportunities. Now, this finding fed into a policy, right? To say that social science is not necessarily shaped by politics is not to say that social science findings don't have political implications. One political implication was that if you are going to try to equalize educational opportunity in the United States and to make up for massive inequalities, especially along racial lines, what you had to do was not simply redistribute resources, but redistribute students. You had to take students who were in concentrated environments of disadvantage and move them around so that they would be with more advantaged students. What this meant in practice were strategies like busing, which continues to be mentioned today. It was a topic in the 2020 election when now President Biden was accused of having opposed busing at a much earlier point in his career. So, busing was seen as a way that you could equalize resources. Coleman, though, followed up his research on the equality of opportunity by looking at what was happening with schools that were attempting to bus. Now, do any of you know from your experience, from courses in political history in the United States, about the climate that accepted busing in the US? Was it a popular policy program? No, busing was enormously unpopular with much of the American population. And many social scientists saw public opposition to busing as something to be overcome, right? If we're going to achieve greater equality of opportunity, and if public opposition is what stands in the way of achieving greater opportunity, then we need to seek ways to overcome it. And if in fact public opposition is limiting access to good schooling, then that public opposition is arguably denying the right to education of students who are seeking to get ahead and maintaining an unequal status quo. Well, Coleman studied the outcomes of busing, and he concluded that it had some negative effects. He concluded, based on I think on what he wanted to find, but on where the evidence led him, that in fact, busing was leading not to greater desegregation of schools, but to greater segregation. That as school districts pursued policies of busing, whites were moving out of desegregating school districts further and further away. And Coleman argued that what was happening was that busing was having unintended consequences, that it was leading to segregated schools being replaced by segregated school districts. Now, a lot of people didn't agree with this, and some of their disagreements involved rational argumentation. Thomas F. Pettigrew argued that Coleman was wrong to focus on busing per se. He argued that what was really creating suburbanization of the white population and resegregation on population lines was not busing, but it was the availability of the interstate system and to discriminatory housing policies. Therefore, he argued that in order to desegregate schools, you needed to promote policies that would aggressively promote equality of opportunity in housing. It's a plausible argument, and so far, so good. You know, that's a reasonable answer, right? It's always reasonable, I think, when you hear an argument to suggest counter arguments. Now, it's also true that this is in no way inconsistent with Coleman's argument, right? Most things that happen in a society are multiple causation, and two things can happen at once. I think, by the way, that the overwhelming body of evidence since then has indicated that Coleman was right. Not only that Coleman was right about whites, but also we've seen in more recent years what you might call middle-class black flight. In other words, as greater opportunities have become available for African Americans in American society, we've seen a movement of middle-class blacks out of lower income inner city neighborhoods for many of the same motivations that pushed whites at an earlier period. Okay, well, it's always possible to have different takes on things and to view things in different ways, but it didn't stay there. It didn't stay there. Coleman was accused not simply of being wrong, and of course, we can all be wrong. We can all be wrong all the time, right? I mean, one thing that we should always, as researchers, keep in mind that there's always the possibility that everything we think could be wrong. And it could be wrong because our own minds are limited by our experiences, by our backgrounds. After Coleman published a follow-up study arguing that busing was creating segregation at the district level, this provoked an intense reaction from many other sociologists. And many of them argued that since he wasn't in favor of busing, therefore he must be against desegregation, right? That because he didn't favor this strategy aimed at desegregating schools, that therefore he must be opposed to desegregation per se. In other words, being in favor of busing became a hallmark of being in favor of desegregation. Anybody who was opposed to busing obviously was opposed to the right and moral way to do things, was obviously opposed to achieving the right goals. This blew back at Coleman in 1976. He had to defend himself. The president of the organization at that time, Alfred McClung Lee, proposed that Coleman be sanctioned, in this case, punished, that a black mark be placed next to his name for unethical behavior. He argued that Coleman had violated the ethical standards of the organization, and Coleman had to defend himself. When he defended himself, he had to stand up at a podium with swastikas drawn behind his head, swastikas that arguably had been put there by over-enthusiastic graduate students. And he had to defend himself against the allegation that he had taken a wrong and therefore immoral political standpoint. Now, in defense of the American Sociological Association, they found him, quote, not guilty, that the sanctions were not applied. And in fact, I believe it was in 1990, Coleman actually became president of the American Sociological Association. So, you know, it's not simply a clear-cut case of persecution of people who have different points of view. So, you know, I think that this suggests to us some of the problems of politically oriented social science, but also, you know, I want to think about the fact that there are arguments on both ends. When we talk about the politics of research, we're talking about the ethics of ends. Not simply how should you do research, you know, should you punish, should you torture people, should you engage in deception, but also in what has been called knowledge for what? What kind of knowledge should you be seeking? What should you do? What should be the goals of research? Social research involves people, and its conclusions, as well as its methods, affect their lives. Almost anything we study has some implication for what we should do. And of course, one response has been what we might consider the prophetic response to wholeheartedly embrace the political nature of social research. To say that, okay, social research influences people, therefore we should do the kinds of research that will in some way enrich the lives of people, that will create a better and more just and more equal society. And there are some arguments for value-driven research. First, research always involves a choice about what to research. And this is at some level a political choice. When James S. Coleman decided that he wanted to study equality of educational opportunity, he was making a choice out of all the possible things that you could look at and choosing something that was politically interesting for him. When you do your own research projects, you're not going to be choosing your own project topics in an intellectual vacuum, right? You'll choose things that interest you, that you consider worthwhile and worth looking at. And what you consider worthwhile and worth looking at is determined by what you consider important, which is a political orientation. Second, political or social commitments are motivations for doing research, right? One of the reasons that people become sociologists is they're concerned about social problems. On the other hand, when you do research, the findings that you come up with can influence your political views, can influence your political commitments. There's also the argument about value-free sociology, that assumptions of objectivity can hide built-in biases. That if we assume that we're objective, that we can be presenting our own political orientations as simply the nature of reality. This is especially problematic for us because all of us come from specific racial or ethnic backgrounds, backgrounds of social class or geography, backgrounds affected by gender, and the assumption of objectivity can mean that we're simply overlooking these background issues and smuggling them in as objective reality. Researchers should have the freedom to pursue their own political goals. I can't tell Joe Fagan that he can't engage in emancipatory sociology, because that would be me telling him what he can and cannot research. I can't tell someone who wants to pursue research because they're a democratic socialist or a libertarian that they can't pursue what they're interested in because I may or may not share their particular political orientation. That academic freedom means that individuals can choose their own goals of research. And connected to number 3, research that is ostensibly politically neutral may just perpetuate the status quo. And a point that I think is especially relevant today is that research findings that don't serve one side may serve as tools for another side. In Coleman's case, long ago, I think that one of the reasons that many people were so opposed to his findings was that they felt his findings could be used by the anti-desegregation. And, this is something that maybe infects our own era even more. Would you say that we live in a completely unpolarized society today? No, our society is highly polarized, with everybody on one side or another. And so some might object that research findings that are ostensibly neutral may be used by the side that we disagree with. I actually think that, this is more of a problem, that the problem becomes even greater if we only research things that support our own side, that polarization is intensified. So there are some arguments for politically value-driven research. There are also some problems with value-driven research. One is that it promotes intellectual conformity. It makes researchers into a Durkheimian moral community, which may sound ponderous. Do you remember Durkheim? Remember studying? What do you remember studying about Durkheim? Durkheim argued that there are essentially 2 things that hold people together. One is a community of belief, and the other is a community of exchange. And that in a community of belief, which he called mechanical solidarity, it's conformity to beliefs that bind people together. Now, the more that people place moral beliefs at the center of community, the more that conformity to moral beliefs becomes the criterion by which everything they do is judged. Durkheim famously said that in a community of saints, the least saintly is a sinner. In a community that's defined by moral values, the less one conforms to the core values of that community, the more those people are judged outside the pale. Now, I think this is a real problem for not only research, but any environment in which the freedom of exchange of ideas is necessary. I actually would argue that a university is not a moral community. That, a university should not be based on moral, not that people in a university should not have moral values, but that we shouldn't place moral values at the center of the university experience because this promotes intellectual conformity. This not only excludes those who don't conform, it also undermines the process of open and skeptical thinking. That you can't think about things that may not be completely consistent with the moral values that are set forth by your research community or by your university community. It also, I think, tends to build confirmation bias into the process of research. Do you know what I mean by confirmation bias? Have you heard that phrase before? And what does it mean, confirmation bias?
Just like seeking out information to confirm what you already think.
Finding what you're looking for, finding what years ago, I was invited to a group of the American Educational Association on affirmative action. And I went there, there was a court case pending. And when I went there, the first thing they told us was, well, we're here because we want you to find research that will support the case in favor of affirmative action. And, one might be in favor of affirmative action, but that's kind of, I think, the wrong place to start. Starting by assuming that your findings are what you want to find, right? And when we put moral values at the center of the research activity, essentially what we're saying is that you should be looking for things that will affirm your own values. Now, I would argue that this is like one of the biggest problems of contemporary sociology is confirmation bias. People finding things that they're looking for because that's what they're supposed to find. There's also the problem of who decides what political values research should promote. Should social research promote social democracy, socialism, libertarianism? Should it promote individual rights, or should it promote equality of distribution? All of these are political questions, and they're legitimate political questions about which individuals may take different views. But if we're saying that social research has to serve political ends, well, whose political ends? Who determines? Is it the person who's in charge of an organization? Is it decided by majority vote, in which case everyone else gets to vote on what you're supposed to think? And finally, or next to last, this is, I think, is contrary to a pluralistic society. Research mainly takes place in the United States today in universities. It also takes place in like think tanks. Think tanks have a greater, I think, latitude for engaging in value-oriented research. But all universities, including Tulane and other private, there's one or two universities that don't accept public money, but Tulane is a 501c3 organization, which means we don't pay taxes as a profit-earning organization. And we also receive public money in other ways. The usual interpretation of a 501c3 organization is that Tulane and other private universities should not engage in partisan politics. They should not openly support one candidate or another in office. But I think one could take that further and say that taxpayers have a legitimate interest in funding debate, but they don't have an interest in funding intellectual monopolies, with which they don't personally agree. And I think that with response to that last point, I think particularly now, it responds to our own current climate of polarization and contributes to it. When research becomes a matter of being on the right side, evidence-based research becomes less important than being on the correct side of things. We already see this, say, in our political climate where there's a disinterest in actual facts. When people talk about alternative facts, when if your views about, say, the last election, many people will argue that the last election was a fraud. There really isn't any evidence to support that. But because this view fits with their own political side, they'll accept whatever suggestions of evidence are presented to them. And I think, this works on more sides. It's especially a problem with what we might call the right today. But, it could be a problem on either side. That you look for evidence to support your own side of things rather than to be self-critical. And I'll just end here with my own thoughts on activist or politically driven research. But first, the answer is not to put bias at the center of the research project, but to think critically about how our own orientations may influence research, and to try to listen to those who disagree with us, even though they may be wrong, and to keep in mind that we might be wrong. Second, I would argue, and I think this is a big issue today, that politically oriented research should be neither mandated nor banned. Governments have no legitimate role to play in saying what researchers can and cannot look at. That you can't, for example, tell people whether one agrees with, say, critical race theory or not. You can't ban it. You can't tell people you can't do this kind of research because we have to respect the choices of others. And third, I think that good research should attempt the very difficult process of trying to compartmentalize political commitments and the process of research. And we can't do away with our political commitments, but we also want to try to, as much as possible, avoid having them drive the kind of research that we do, and only look for evidence that will support what we already want to find. Okay, I think we're already at the end of our time. We'll begin on Thursday with an overview of how you do research design, how they work, oriented towards nothing but
Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you.